introduce our panelists, please.
Sure. Thank you, Magda, and hello, everyone, and hello, all our panelists. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce today a great panel today. We have Barry Johnson, a great thought leader, and it will be an absolute pleasure to listen to him today, listen to his latest thoughts on what's happening around the world. Then we have Beena Sharma. She's from Vertical Development Academy and a great thought leader coach in terms of human development and different maturity models she's going to talk to us about. And also I'm happy to welcome Joe, former law enforcement expert, and also a great thoughts from him on what's going to happen today, what's happening with us, and what should happen. So not saying more, but it's a pleasure to welcome everyone. And also it's a great experience that I'm also looking forward to support this panel. And we can begin as and when Barry is ready, and we can proceed further.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for welcoming us. And what we're going to do in this session is we're going to have 3 short presentations, then a brief dialogue between the 3 of us on the panel, and then open the session up for discussion with you as well. And please feel free to put things in the chat room as we go through the process. What I'm going to be talking about today is about interdependent pairs. They're called paradox or polarities or dilemma. But what they are interdependent pairs that show up in life, like inhaling and exhaling. They come as a set, so it doesn't make sense to connect those 2 pairs with the word or. It makes more sense to connect them with and. So for example, we know obviously that we need to both inhale and exhale. It would be silly to fight over whether we're going to be inhalers in the future or exhalers in the future. No matter who wins in that fight, we're going to be blue in the face soon. So the question is, whenever we deal with a conflict or a change effort, the question is, are we dealing with an underlying polarity? Let me share, and if it is an underlying polarity, then or does not make sense. And is what we need. So let me give you an example in terms of leadership. Leaders need to be both clear and flexible. If they're clear without being flexible, they're rigid. If they're flexible without being clear, they're ambiguous. So with all polarities, the objective is to maximize your clarity and maximize your flexibility and minimize being rigid or ambiguous. And that leads to effective leadership. Let me share another example in life that is an obvious polarity. We need to do both. We need both activity and rest. So for example, when we're physically and mentally active, we get a sharp mind, our body gets toned, and we get stimulated and challenged. So all of us need to be active, for sure. But if we're active without getting any rest, what happens is our sharp mind gets on overload. Our body, instead of being toned, gets exhausted. Instead of being stimulated and challenged, we end up being burned out. So activity without rest has this downside dysfunction. Now, when we experience the downside of activity, the natural self-correction is to get the benefits of rest. So we go to the rest side, we integrate our thoughts, we rejuvenate our body and become relaxed. Notice how when we're in the downside of activity, the logical place to go is to the upside of rest, but it's not a solution. It's not sustainable. If we focus on rest to the neglect of activity, we end up in the downside of rest alone. So instead of integrating thoughts, we get a dulled mind. Instead of rejuvenated body, we get out of shape. And instead of being relaxed, we become boring and lack stimulation. So with all polarities, what we have is there are 2 upsides and 2 downsides, and the objective is to maximize those 2 upsides and minimize the downsides. And or thinking does not make sense. With all polarities, it's a false choice between one or the other. Activity or rest makes no sense. So let me just use this brief introduction about polarities and focus on how we leverage these polarities. So for example, if you want to run a marathon, you are in this activity and rest polarity, and you're in a position where you can't run a marathon, but you want to be able to run a marathon. Now what you need to do is you need to intentionally, what we call leverage, the polarity of activity and rest. Now, the activity and rest polarity is available to all of us. We're all in it. But we can't all run a marathon. In order to run a marathon, you have to intentionally do this, manage activity and rest. So on the activity side, we need to increase our endurance. So we have action steps like running further most workout days to increase that endurance. But we can't just work out without having the muscles build on the rest cycle. Muscles actually build on the rest cycle, assuming that you've been active. So what we need to do to complement our running most workout days is we need to get adequate downtime between workouts. So with polarities, we want to have action steps that maximize both upsides, and we also want to minimize the downsides. So if we overfocus on activity to the neglect of rest, we're going to get muscle injury. So how do we avoid muscle injury? We pay attention to early warnings, like we might wake up some morning and feel tired. Didn't get enough sleep that night. Maybe we plan to run 10 miles that day, but we decide I'm going to cut back and just run 5 to make sure that I don't have a muscle injury. The downside of rest without activity is muscle atrophy. The early warning for muscle atrophy might be in your training regimen that you miss a workout day. And you notice that. Now, if you're on a 6-month regimen for running a marathon, missing a workout day is not a big issue. But what you can't do is continue to miss workout days. So with all polarities, what we're trying to do in this case to run a marathon, you need to maximize both upsides by running most workout days and getting an adequate downtime. And you need to avoid muscle injury and muscle atrophy. Now, I've got a story to share about this. My son, Tim, has qualified 5 times for the Boston Marathon. But one of those times, he ended up not going to the Boston Marathon because he overfocused on the activity pole and ran further and harder. And what happened is he ended up not giving himself enough downtime. And so he ended up with shin fractures. Now, what we say with all polarities, if you overfocus on one pole to the neglect of the other, first you get the downside of the pole on which you overfocus. In this case, he got shin fractures. But notice what also happens. He ended up also with the downside of rest because he was laid up in bed with his shin fractures. So he got both muscle injury and muscle atrophy. So with all polarities, what we want to do is maximize both upsides and minimize the downsides. That's how they work. And that will support you in getting to what is our greater purpose. Why manage this polarity well or leverage it well is to run a marathon. The greater purpose, by the way, comes from John Shearer's work. John was working with me between the first book and the second book. So that's the greater purpose. So now let's focus on a story, an application story with a business. We know about how polarities look and work. So I'd like you to imagine that you're on a phone call with 3 people from a Fortune 10 company in the United States. This company is located in 46 countries. And they are inviting me to come to a gathering. It's a workshop gathering where they're bringing in their top 200 people from around the world. And the theme of the gathering, it's a 4-day gathering. The theme is leading through values. And they're talking with me about what I might do with polarity thinking. And when they told me the theme, I said, oh, that's terrific, because values come in pairs. And so if we're looking at leading through values, we can look at a polarity lens and look at values coming in pairs as the 2 upsides of a polarity. And I got interrupted by the chief operating officer, who was one of the 3 in the call. And he said, wait a minute, are you saying that values come in pairs? And I said, yes, sir, I think so. So when I work with organizations and they're creating their values, I encourage them to create them in pairs. But if they are just, if they already have a list of values, then what I do is I look at the list with them and we decide whether within that values list, they're usually fairly short, does one of the values in the list, is it balanced by another value in the list? For example, if they had inhaling, I'd be looking for exhaling. And if they didn't have exhaling, I would encourage them to add exhaling to the list, because there's nothing wrong with inhaling, but without exhaling, it's a problem. So he now says, wait a minute. If you're going to be talking with our top 200 people around our values, and you're going to be messing with our values in front of them, I want to know what you do with them. So they sent me their values. It was a relatively short list. And I'm trying to think now, the greater purpose at the top here, how might I give them a competitive advantage in this very conversation? So that's my greater purpose, and avoid the possibility that they won't be able to compete. So I look at the list and autonomous business unit shows up as a value. So I'm thinking, all right, autonomous business units. I'm going to give you 5 seconds per quadrant in the chat room to fill out the rest of this map. Because when we look at a polarity map, the objective is to first see it as a polarity and then to fill out the map and see it more clearly. So if they had autonomous business units, my question to you is, what would you be looking for on their values list, which would be a good balance to autonomous business units to keep them from getting in trouble with that autonomy? What would be the other pole, a polarity, if you will? So 5 seconds, what would be some things? Just put it in the chat room. Go ahead.
So, global conspiracy, oversight, interdependent, integration across silos, collaboration, cooperative.
Great, exactly. So all of those would work. So notice in 5 seconds, you can come up with something. What I came up with when I was responding to them fit with exactly what you're saying. We're not looking for a correct word necessarily, but a general theme. And you picked up on that theme, some side of coordination or system integration. So I suggested what was missing was integrated business units, like the list you came up with. Their response was, well, so what do you make of that? It was clear they didn't have anything like centralized coordination or integrated business units. I said, well, your organization is experiencing or will experience the following dysfunctions. I'm going to give you another 5 seconds to come up with what might those dysfunctions be. What they will be is the negative results from over-focusing autonomous business units to the neglect of integrated business units because they didn't have it in their values. So 5 seconds, what kind of vulnerabilities would the organization have if they over-focused on autonomy to the neglect of integrated? Go ahead.
Inefficiency, integral, dysfunctional competition, too much control, competition for resources, silo disconnected,
Okay,
mixed
terrific.
messages.
Yep, exactly. Now, I'd like to point out what's happening is you are spontaneously, within 5 seconds, diagnosing an organization that was in multi-million dollars worth of trouble. And what you came up with fits exactly. They were having silos, isolation of the business units, excess competition, and redundancies, everything that you listed. They were experiencing that. And I said, you're going to experience these things like the list you just generated. And I said, you're going to then identify it as a problem. And when you do, you're going to bring together the business unit heads from the 46 countries that you're located and your central administration. You're going to bring that group together and you're going to say, we have a problem. And then you're going to identify what you need to do as a solution, what you're going to need to do to solve this problem that you identify. Now, what I want you to do is fill in this quadrant. The solution will actually be the upside of what happens if you have, some sort of integrated business units. What would the positive results be from doing a good job of integrating the business units? Again, 5 seconds. What are they going after? Go.
Increased consistency, collaboration, economies of scale, coherence, lower costs, common frameworks, clear line of sight, synergy.
Terrific. All right. It absolutely works. So that's exactly what they would say. In summary, integration of the business units, collaboration, mutual support, and everything you came up with. It's a much richer collection because you've helped contribute to it. So essentially, I said you're going to identify that as a problem. You're going to get together. You're going to agree to the person to go after these upsides, including the whole list you just generated, right? Then I say to them, but you're not going to go there. Now, there's silence on the end of the phone. And I pause for a second and I say, hello. And this chief operating officer in a very gruff voice says to me, who have you been talking to? And I say, I haven't been talking to anybody about this. It's just that I know how values work and how polarities work. And he said, wait a minute. He said, I know how you came up with the silos and excess competition with our focus on autonomous business units. And I understand how you came up with the integration of the business units and collaboration, mutual support, and synergy as where we wanted to move. But did I hear you correctly? And you said we weren't going to walk our talk? And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, I want to know how you knew that because I held that meeting 2 years ago. We agreed to the person that we were going to go towards integration of business units and collaboration and mutual support. We've hardly moved an inch in 2 years. I want to know how you knew that we weren't going to walk our talk, because heads are starting to roll and we're losing millions of dollars in our inability to get there. So I explained to them that it was because it was a polarity, and then we went and had a meeting with the 200 people, and they got in groups of 6 and they generated this polarity map. They started off with these 2, and then we looked at what was missing. The problem with what they had generated was not what was there, but what was missing. And they assumed that if they had a problem and a solution, is all they needed was a strategy to get it. But in fact, there was something that they as an organization were holding on to, a very strong value set that drove them to have autonomous business units in their value system in the first place. Now, so what would be the positive results from doing a good job of allowing autonomy in your business units, especially if you're located in 46 countries? This is something they were holding on to very strongly. What would that be? 5 seconds, go.
Flexibility, bespoke, nimbleness, ideas, agility, innovation, freedom, creativity,
Yes,
empowerment.
yes, exactly. Great. Notice how wonderful that list is that you just generated. Entrepreneurial initiative, speed and responsiveness, and everything you came up with. But it doesn't show up in the gap analysis. Gap analysis just has a problem with the present state, an ideal preferred future, and strategy to get there. What a polarity map allows you to pay attention to is, what might we be holding on to that we need to hold on to? What is the upside of the pole we're moving from? And what are we afraid of if we actually move to the integrated business units we claim we want, the collaboration we want? If we value the upside of autonomous business units, a 99 on 100 scale, we'll be afraid of losing it, and something we want to avoid on the downside of integrated business units. So, final thing, what would be the negative results if you overfocus on integrated business units to the neglect of autonomous business units? What, in other words, what would this system be afraid of if they actually moved towards integration of the business units? Go ahead.
Slow down, lethargy, rigidity, bureaucracy, complacency, local focus.
Okay, great, great. So what they're trying to avoid is bureaucracy and red tape and slow and unresponsive. Exactly. So you have filled out a map. You've been given essentially 25 seconds to fill out a map, the content of which and the understanding of which was costing a Fortune 10 company in the United States, located in 46 countries, to lose millions of dollars because they weren't able to walk their talk. But you understood it because of your wisdom from your own history. And all you needed was a polarity map to fill in the content and give you 5 seconds. That's plenty of time. So if you want to give a competitive advantage, you need to both focus on autonomous business units and integrated business units, and you need to have action steps to do both and pay attention to early warnings for each. So some key points to take away from this. In the process of becoming awake to something and aware of a particular issue that you want to rise up and address, it will be important for you to pay attention to the fact that the problem you identify that you're aware of could be the downside of a polarity. And as you rise up to move towards the solution, you may experience a lot of resistance that will come from people who are holding on to something that is very important to hold on to. So you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. They're holding on to something important, and they're afraid of going to where you're suggesting because it has a downside. If you can introduce a polarity map to the discussion, then you have an opportunity to pay attention to and leverage both poles of the polarity. So that's a quick introduction to polarities and an example of how they work in a large system. And now I'd like to turn it over to Bina.
Thank you so much, Barry. I never tire hearing again about just the basics of polarities and how significant they are in terms of how we think about situations and about our life experiences. Hello, everyone. My name is Bina. I've been working with Barry's work and polarities for the last 21 years. and for the last 15 years have been focused particularly on adult development, what I might call human maturity. And I have found that polarity thinking is one of the key markers and vehicles for us developing maturity. I just wanted to mention to you, Barry, since you mentioned John Shearer's name, he's on the call today. So John, thanks for being with us. So before I begin, I just want a quick question, and you can put in your responses. I have two quick questions for you. The first is a yes or no question. Do you think some people are more mature than others? Yes or no? A similar question would be, have you encountered some people who are more mature than others who are less mature? Yes or no?
All
Very
yes.
likely. I mean, that's a no-brainer. It feels like we all know that. So we already have a good understanding of what maturity is. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to discern or judge. So the second question is, so what are some characteristics of maturity in your view? So think about people you've met where you walked away after an interaction thinking, oh, that's a better way of looking at it than I had. Or you walked away from an interaction thinking, I wouldn't do that, or that's not supportive, or that's not healthy.
Okay. Bina, we have like balance, listening skills, detachment, perspective taking, objective, empathetic, aware, great presence, understanding and level-headed, attitude, able to see beyond themselves, inclusive,
Great, thank you.
both
Yes,
and
somebody said
thinking.
both and thinking. I love that. And that is the connection that I am here to make today. Just as Barry talked about, either or thinking being at the root cause of a lot of the suffering and difficulties we see in the world today, both and augmenting that with both and thinking is a matter of taking a more mature perspective. So with that, we can go to the next slide. So when we look at development, we make a distinction in development. We make a distinction between horizontal development and vertical development. Horizontal development is when we continue to learn and grow. And what is happening is we're adding more information, we have more skills, we have more credentials, we have greater expertise, and we're able to carry that in newer and newer areas. However, that learning doesn't necessarily shift the way we see things, the way we solve problems, or the fundamental assumptions we make. Vertical development, on the other hand, is when we, as a result of experiencing something that doesn't quite work the way we want it, it challenges our ideas about what we are seeing, and it helps us come up with a new perspective. I can imagine all of you can think 20 years ago, you are not the person today that you were 20 years ago. You have had several transformative experiences that have led you to see the world differently, and that's vertical development. We all have ideas about how things work, who I am and what the world is, or who you are. And through life experiences, our ideas get challenged, and we have to come up with a new way of understanding. And that leads to vertical development. Next slide, please. So this is a good metaphor to describe vertical development. These stages of development have actually been codified. There's 45 years of research as an outcome of listening to thousands of stories that people tell about themselves and about the world. And these patterns can be seen. And when you see the pattern, you see a progression of more and more mature perspectives, more and more inclusiveness, more and more embrace of people that were originally within our little sort of framework. We now move from just our family focus to not just our family, but our community, to our neighborhood, to our country, and then to the planet, and then to all beings, and then to all of existence. So this progression you can see as a result of this research, and that's just one element. So the way I would summarize vertical development is there is a ladder. There is these rungs of the ladder describe these stages of development, and each stage is distinctive. You can recognize them, and there are markers. It can also be measured. The climber is the one that's climbing, and that is that part of ourselves that's trying to make meaning. We're trying to explain, we're trying to understand, we get challenged, and then we come up with a new way of understanding. That's the climber, and that's called the ego or the meaning maker. And this is based on ego development theory. The view is how we see the world at each level. Like I said, 20 years ago, you saw the world very differently than you see the world now. So the view is different at each stage. And then the last is the climbing, this process of movement. How do we even get there? Now, polarity thinking has a key role to play in that climbing, in moving from seeing the world in mechanical black or white ways to seeing the world in more of a rich texture and seeing the complexity and being able to hold an integrative perspective. This work is now available to us as a gift to orient our development. Until 25 years ago, this was only a research project or a research framework. It wasn't allowed to be used. And I'm just thrilled and excited that we have this as a gift to guide our journey and to interpret our journey. And so now we have these two roles. We have the facilitator of vertical development, which can be ourselves. If I understand more about where I'm coming from and what's next for me, then I can invite myself into a more enlightened perspective. And then there is actually the professional role of a coach that can tailor development, can tailor coaching to different stages of development. And this is new. And this can be leveraged for real development rather than doing coaching without an understanding of stages and ending up with a lot of horizontal development and not even recognizing the difference between horizontal and vertical development. Next slide. So that brings us to the model, the 8 stages of development. You don't have to, read all of this. I just want to point out that there are 8 stages. And on the left side, you can see 85% of humanity or the general population come from what is called a conventional stage, where the focus is more on knowledge, on problem solving, on predicting and measuring and explaining and discovering the rules and following the rules. Whereas on the right side, when you get past that ceiling, then people step more into wisdom, into understanding the assumptions, understanding more deeply, owning what is unconscious, seeing within, and then coming up with a more integrative, inclusive way of looking. A simple way to say is that on the left side of the arc, we are really in the business of building an identity and becoming somebody. And on the right side, we begin to question our identity. We become everybody. So we break the boundaries and then we can actually relate. And you can imagine people that are in later stages of development, you can imagine that they can create a world where we are all equal, where there is no poverty, there is no bias, and we see each other as a mirror of all that is. And that is the last stage, which is the unitive perspective. Next slide, please. So some things we can say, I think I have 2 more minutes. Some things we can say about the general about the movement is that this sequence of development is invariant. You can't skip a stage. Nobody's born at an earlier stage or a later stage. And each stage is a transformation. Each stage is more comprehensive, more flexible. And people from later stages have greater respect for the uniqueness and difference of others. There's a greater depth of mind and heart. And this is the big link that I feel has been one of my contributions in the great work that both Barry has done and my mentor, Suzanne Kugreuter, has done, which is bringing polarity thinking into the realm of maturity and how polarity thinking is a lever for us to move into later stages of development. I cannot underestimate the significance of this work. It is the most important thing I have learned, and it applies all the way up and all the way down. No stage is exempt from the gift of working with this framework. And the next, and this is my last slide. So this gives you just an illustrative list. The conventional realm is on the left side of the arc, where we are trying to build and exert our influence. And then the right side is when we become more mature and we begin to include the other pole. So I'll just leave this on for 10 seconds for you to just look at it and think about the left side. If you had all of the left side stacked up, what kind of a profile do you get? Somebody that is interested only in the self, short term, being very certain, being controlling, and doing either or thinking. Not because they are bad people, but because they don't yet have the capacity. They haven't had the life lessons. Life is in the process of evolving them. And as they get evolved into a post-conventional perspective, then they're able to include others' interests, think more long-term, be more participative and inclusive, be open to ambiguity. I don't know, I'm not quite sure. And then enabling and letting go and including both and yes, they are polarity pairs, John. And that's why this model helps you look at what is excluded earlier, then gets included. And that is a more wholesome development. So that is, that's my piece. I'm very excited to introduce this idea to those of you who aren't familiar with this. What I have done is looked at each stage of development and the polarities that we have to navigate at each stage as a function of our worldview, not necessarily a function of our style or our personality. So if you're interested, get in touch, and thanks for this opportunity to share with Barry.
Thank you very much, Veena, for that. My name is Joseph McMillan, and I'm honored to be here today. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a retired federal agent, and I've also finished my research using Dr. Johnson's theory of polarity management, as well as Dr. Benet's Polarities of Democracy. And I've got up on the screen the 5 democratic values that comprise the Polarities of Democracy theory, and I'm going to get to them in a minute. But let me tell you a little bit about the Institute. The Institute for Polarities of Democracy is a nonprofit organization established and headquartered in the Washington, D.C. area. And it's focused on application, research, and positive social change using Dr. Barry Johnson's polarity thinking and Dr. William Benet's Polarities of Democracy theory. Founded in 1976 and based in Alexandria, Virginia, the nonprofit organization known as NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, is one for which I was affiliated with. I'm a past national president of NOBLE. And that organization is comprised and represents over 3,000 international members, primarily African-American chiefs of police, officers, in administrative positions, senior positions, at the local, state, as well as the federal levels across the United States and again internationally. Now, NOBLE's mission is to ensure equity in the administration of justice and the provision of public service to all communities, and to serve as the conscience of law enforcement by being committed to justice by actions. So how does this come into play with regards to polarity thinking and the polarities of democracy? The polarities of democracy theory promotes participatory practices that allow citizens, workers and families and organizations and communities to unleash their creativity and strengthen their capacity for both research and social change initiatives that promote social and environmental justice and responsibility. So within the polarities of democracy theory, and I've got them up on the screen here, they encompass these democratic values. And again, the polarities of democracy are value-centric issues. You got freedom and authority. You got justice and due process. You got human rights, communal obligations, participation, as well as representation. The theory uses Dr. Johnson's polarity thinking concept to show how the energy system of interdependent pairs work over time in a pattern of shifting from one pole to the other. Dysfunction in this natural dynamic occurs when or thinking, either this pole or that pole, assuming the two cannot coexist, is applied to interdependent pair polarities as a solution to the tension. This misdiagnosis of a polarity that requires both and thinking can interrupt the flow of energy, creating vicious cycles and dysfunction. As the downside of an overemphasized pole becomes stronger, oppositional forces coming similarly from an either-or thinking perspective begin to push for the benefits of the opposite pole because they tend to see only the positive aspects of that pole. Those who resist those changes, they tend to see only the positive aspects of the current pole's values, that they defend and fear the negative results of poles that could result from those advocating for change. So the Institute, following the horrific death of George Floyd in this country, leveraged its capabilities and charted a path to develop a multi-year anti-racism initiative with Noble. The power of the Institute's vision is in marrying the tools and processes of over 4 decades of polarity approach development with the basic principles of democracy drawn from centuries of literature about freedom and governance into the one unifying polarities of democracy theory. The anti-racism initiative that I just spoke to comprises actually 3 different components. And what we did is we looked at a body of work that was being done post-President Obama's administration, known as the 21st Century Policing Report. A significant amount of effort and work went into that to try and bring communities as well as the police departments a lot closer together. So what we were doing is using polarities of democracy theory in one of these components of our expertise and capabilities. The Institute has embarked on this initiative to engage and support Noble's effort to transform the policing culture from a warrior mentality to one of guardianship through transformational reforms, particularly related to the tenets of that 21st century policing report by applying these different democratic values. By applying the polarities of democracy and aligned theories to the tenets of 21st century in order to analyze and assess police culture to develop and implement cultural transformation reform efforts that ensure all citizens are treated with dignity and respect. Another part of the component of this initial component we'll be doing with Noble is developing policies consistent with the 21st century policing in several pillars. That first pillar would be one that was developed called building trust and legitimacy in communities. The Institute views this as embracing the concept of guardianship versus the warrior mentality through effectively leveraging the positive aspects of all 5 pair of democratic values comprising the polarities of democracy theory. Secondly, by developing policies consistent with pillar number 2 of that report, which deals with policy as well as oversight. The Institute views this as an area that addresses the need for reformation of national policing standards, including but not used to the use of force, that reflects community values consistent with the polarities of democracy elements. And thirdly, with respect to that first component, developing policies consistent with the 21st century policing pillar number 4, which deals specifically with policing, crime reduction, and the Institute views this as a guiding the philosophy of all stakeholders through a collaboration between law enforcement and citizens to develop healthy, sustainable, as well as just communities through the values consistent with the polarities of democracy framework. So one of the things I'm going to do real quick is I'm just going to take you through an example of a polarity, what a polarity map might look like relative to the justice and the due process polarities of democracy theory. So if you were to have justice on one side and due process as the opposite pole in that, communities and the police might look at, on the due process side, the police community having a voice in the ongoing review of policies and procedures for discrepancies in enforcement. Now on the justice side, which would be the opposite quadrant, in the lower quadrant, it might be our police department does not treat all people in the community fairly. Conversely, on the value side of the justice side, it might be police and communities are clear that laws and policies and procedures used to maintain safety are fair. Where if you look in the lower quadrant of the due process side, it might appear to be our department processes support some people being treated unfairly in the community. So these are interdependent. And again, you're trying to always work towards the upper quadrant and reduce the amount of time that's spent in those lower quadrants of the two poles. So our greater purpose in trying to decide something like this is that we would have fairness and responsiveness by the police department and the community that leads to both trust as well as legitimacy. And as I stated previously, then the downside of that, which you don't want to have, will be unfair and unresponsive to either the police or the community. Our second component in this initiative that we're working with Noble deals with anti-racism and systemic social change policy action agenda. The Institute will develop a policy and action agenda that applies the polarities of democracy and aligned theories to research and social change initiatives across a broad spectrum of issues designed to address racial disparity in America. This agenda will seek to ensure appropriate investment and commitment to societal systems, including but not limited to mental health, employment, the social economy, public education, healthcare, social work, housing, and the environment. The Institute's advocacy agenda will embrace a bold vision designed to address racial, social, economic, and environmental disparities through such policies as guaranteed living wages, jobs, universal health care, affordable housing, a Green New Deal, and progressive forms of income and wealth taxes to make the promise of democracy a reality. And then finally, our third component relative to working with Noble is the transformational reforms. The Institute will develop a comprehensive approach that applies the polarities of democracy and align theories to organizational and systems transformation methodologies that are compatible with Noble's focus on transferring of police culture from a warrior mentality to that of one of guardianship. This comprehensive approach will apply reformed efforts across organizations, institutions, and systems that include, but are not limited to, mental health, institutions, employment, and the social economy, public education. As part of the initiative, as part of the Institute's commitment to positive social change and dedication to advancing healthy and sustainable and just communities. So the point I'm trying to get across relative to the polarities of democracy is especially these democratic values. The way the policing systems and the way communities look at them might very well be different. But until you get to folks together in the room and they can map out what those upsides and those downsides look relative to each of these pairs, they're really not speaking from the same sheet of music. And when you're looking at the policing culture, traditionally I've always stated policing is very tactical. It's not a very strategic type of an approach. This type of a concept provides for more strategy in using polarity thinking and using polarity of democracy to see, are these values in communities? So to the extent communities and the police departments come together in alignment and seeing the values of these different compositions of the theory, we think they're in a much better position to leverage themselves and to work truly in a collaborative environment in those communities. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Johnson to continue our conversation relative to polarity thinking.
Okay, thanks a lot, Joe. I appreciate the work you're doing in the tensions that we experience right now with, with police community relations. And we have had some very significant work done on police community relations in the United States. One example is in Charleston, South Carolina, where they worked on police community relations, had a special, what's called Illumination Project there that has now been reproduced in a few other cities in the United States. And at the heart of it is our paying attention to some key polarities. For just a final revisit to especially the issue, the larger issue, so this is more international, the larger issue is the interface between dominant cultures and marginalized cultures, which is itself a polarity. And one of the things that I think is important for us to pay attention to is that a polarity lens helps us understand why and how we create marginalized cultures without blaming or condoning some individual or group as an evil source. there really is no evil source. There's no individual or group is inherently evil. Looking for an evil source undermines efforts to gain diversity, equity, and belonging. And as an alternative for finding an evil source, let me just say something about this evil source process. When we look for a root cause, so we have poverty, racism, and sexism. If we look at within a culture where we have the poverty, we have racism, we have sexism showing up in that culture, the question is, well, where did this come from? And so we look to men as the evil source for sexism. We look for white people as an evil source for racism, and we look rich people as an evil source for poverty. We also look for we say, well, no, it's not just about the people. We need not just address the people, but we need to address the systems that those people have created. So we have systemic poverty, racism, and sexism. In this pursuit of an evil source, it is true that there are evil results. Poverty, racism, and sexism, I think, are evil results, but you do not have to have an evil source that causes an evil result. You can arrive at evil results in an alternative way. When we look for an evil source, the problem is we find one, and it's either ourselves or somebody else, and then we have to either lock them up or convince them to change who they are, or abuse them in some way. And this abuse and attack of the evil source, if it's us, then for me, example is a white male with enough money, with adequate income. Either I blame somebody else or I blame myself, neither of which is useful. Blame myself, I get into white guilt. Blame others, I'm just projecting stuff I can't own. So the question is there an alternative to understand how we can get into this evil? And I'm suggesting that an alternative explanation is that our efforts to become effective in our awake, aware, and arise process could lead to an overfocus on one pole and getting into that downside. And the understanding of how we can arrive at evil results is by a combination of overfocusing on one pole to the neglect of the other pole. And if you get that downside and you combine it with another pole in which you overfocus on one pole to the neglect of the other, it's this combination of overfocusing on one pole to the neglect of the other, of multiple polarities, that can be seen as a root cause of poverty, racism, and sexism. And let me just show you, so the down arrow here indicates that we need to pay attention to these if we want to be effective. If we don't pay attention, we'll be ineffective in our awake, aware, and arise process. So I want to talk about 4 legitimate desires below, which become problematic when pursued without their interdependent pair. Just like inhaling is great, inhaling without exhaling is problematic. And so like activity and rest are great. Activity is great, but activity without rest is problematic. So I'm going to talk about some things that are great of themselves, but without their partner become dysfunctional. So the first one is we want to solve problems. When we want to solve problems, when we see a polarity, we say, should we do this or should we do that? And so when we use or thinking between 2 poles of a polarity, for example, should we focus on health or the economy when we face the pandemic? The answer is we need to pay attention to both. So what happens is when we give or thinking to a polarity without and, it becomes a vicious cycle. So we fight over the 2 poles when it becomes a vicious cycle, and that leads to polarization. In order to optimize that tension, we need to see it as a polarity. So what happens when we think about or without and we bring that or thinking, that's the first false choice. We've chosen or over and thinking. When we bring that false choice of or to another desire, the desire to protect. I want to protect my family. I want to protect my organization. I want to protect my country. When I consult with the United States military, their whole focus is on serving and protecting, which is understandable. And what happens is, in order to protect, we look at the polarity of claiming power and sharing power. And if we assume that we can't claim power and share power, then we find ourselves needing to claim power over in order to protect. And claiming power without sharing power becomes an abuse of power. So we end up with or thinking, which we bring to claiming power or sharing power, and it becomes, we focus on claiming power without sharing power, and that leads to an abuse of power. So for example, the United States, in its effort to claim power without sharing power, has spent more on defense than the next 7 countries have spent on their defense in the whole world. So this is all a focus on claiming power without sharing power. And when that happens, it leads to an abuse of power. Another example of this showing up in terms of poverty and racism, in the United States, we ended up, white European immigrants ended up looking at claiming power or sharing power, deciding we needed to claim power, and in that claiming power, unwilling to share it, which led to using that power, strong military power, to claim land, to take from native peoples, and we claimed power over Black people who were coming in shackles to our shores, and we claimed power over them in order to work the land for free, or for just essentially unpaid room and board. So we ended up instituting slavery as a way to claim power and end up putting Indians on reservations and claiming power over slaves. This is obviously an abuse of power. The next thing we do, the next thing besides protect, is to provide. So all of us want to provide for our family, care for them. But when we look at providing and we bring our power that we have now won, we've claimed that power, and our or thinking, we bring that to the notion of, can we have abundance for some or basics for all? We end up having gross inequality. The fact is, we can have abundance for some and we can have basics for all. But if we bring our either or thinking and our power to the question about abundance for some, we end up perpetuating the power over that we generated in the first place. So the very reasons that we wanted to claim power in the first place, because we needed to protect ourselves, we also now use that claimed power to both secure our abundance and to maintain it. The final thing is belonging. And in the area of belonging, all of us wants to belong, and we usually choose a group. We have a group we were born in, a group that we decide is our clique, our tribe, our country, whatever. But in our effort to belong, what we do is we identify what are the rules, what are the requirements to belong to this group. And the underlying polarity here is justice and mercy. What happens in our effort to belong is we look at what are the rules that require us to be a member of this group. And we establish those rules, and the assumption is that if some rules are good, that more rules are going to be better. And rules without consequences have no meaning. So we end up saying, well, if some consequences are necessary, harsher consequences will be better. What happens where we're headed with this is harsher and harsher rules in order to belong, and more and more rules and harsher consequences. This leads us to doing things like stoning a woman to death for being pregnant out of wedlock. It leads to us being extremely cruel and self-righteous about it. So how did we get there? Well, we got there by wanting to belong and by believing that laws are important and that consequences are important. But when we have justice without mercy, it leads to self-righteous cruelty. And this combination of focusing on or thinking and solving problems, claiming power without sharing power, having abundance for some without basics for all, and looking at justice without mercy, that combination is the basic root cause of poverty, racism, and sexism. And how do we respond to that? How do we address that? We need to supplement or thinking with and thinking. We need to both solve problems and leverage polarities. We need to both protect and claim power for ourselves and share power with others. We need to provide for some and provide basics for all. We can provide basic education, basic healthcare, basic housing, basic jobs with a decent pay. We can provide basics for everyone, and we can keep our nice houses. The assumption is that we can't have both a nice house and provide basic housing for everyone. In fact, we can. It just requires both and thinking. And finally, we can have justice with mercy. As Desmond Tutu said in his book, No Future Without Forgiveness, all of us need to have both justice and mercy. We can belong to our unique group, and we can belong to the world and and all of common humanity. So the above four polarities seen as problems to solve are a root cause and perpetuator of poverty, racism, and sexism. So what I'd like to shift to now is maybe if we went right to the chat room and had a dialogue between us and all of the people who are sitting in on this conversation. So are there questions or insights you have for one of the three of us, or all of us? Is there anybody there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So, okay, there's one question. Can I bounce it off to you right now, Barry?
Sure. Or the three of us. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what polarities are the Democrats and Republicans representing, and what is the way forward in the US?
Two of the polarities that the Democrats and Republicans are struggling with right now. Let's look at them in terms of the pandemic, for example. There are two key polarities around the pandemic. One of them is focusing on the health, and the other one is focusing on the economy. Now, the breakdown tends to be in the United States that the Republicans tend to focus on the economy, which is a legitimate point. We need to pay attention to the economy. And Democrats are more focusing on, we need to pay attention to healthcare. Now, obviously, we need to focus on both. But when you see it as an either or proposition, then that's what leads to an extreme difficulty. So for example, when we got into the recent administration, Republicans took over after the Democrat Obama administration. During the Obama administration, there was set up for healthcare an organization that was designed to anticipate and watch for and respond to pandemics. That healthcare system that was built into our government on the healthcare side was seen as not cost effective when Republicans came in, when President Trump came in. And so that whole system was taken out, was cut out of the budget in order to save money. So it was focusing on the economy, but it was doing it to the relative neglect of healthcare. That caused us to be vulnerable to get the downside of over-focusing on the economy to the neglect of healthcare, which meant we have lost over 200,000 lives, which is the downside of over-focusing on the economy to the neglect of healthcare. So we became vulnerable to that. But notice what happened with all polarities. When you over-focus on one pole to the neglect of the other, first you get the downside of the pole you over-focus on. So we got the downside of over-focusing on the economy, which was less than adequate attention to healthcare, which resulted in the pandemic having its greatest repercussions in the United States in any place in the world. And now we're also experiencing the downside of what would be over-focusing on healthcare, which is we're getting the downside of over-focusing on the healthcare, which is the economy is disrupted. So when you over-focus on the economy to the neglect of healthcare, it ruins our health and it ruins our economy. That's one example.
Yeah. And remaining no questions, but a lot of compliments for you. It's I mean all it's flowing all around. So somebody has mentioned, Barry, you have become so smart. I think a lot of vertical development for your own self. So and there is a comment from John. President Trump is showing up very often as people's shadow character, Barry, even over here in the Eastern Europe. What a great teacher he is turning out to be.
Yes, yes. President Trump is he's an easy person to project on the things we don't want to own. And what we need to recognize, all of us, is that we are Donald Trump. That the characteristics of Donald Trump that we don't like are in fact parts of ourselves that we don't like.
Yeah.
And we need to own up to that. Because when we can't own up to our shortcomings, then we need to find somebody to project on. What I'd like to do is I'd like to shift, just in terms of responding to the question, to just check in with Bina and with Joe in terms of your reflections on what we've talked about so far and the questions that are coming up.
Okay. Yes.
I'll just say one thing, Barry, which is just a follow-up what you just said, that if we don't own the things that are within us, then we're only going to project it to others, and the others become the problem, or they become the evil source. And that is a marker of maturity. When we begin to see our own unconscious bias, when we begin to even realize that we have an unconscious, that we have agendas that we are not aware of. So maturity is about coming into that understanding and being able to own that and to be able to see our shadows in the mirror of our responses and of what we see in the world. So they're so intimately connected, this work around polarities and maturity. I just wanted to add that.
Okay.
I feel I'm repeating myself because this is my fundamental case. Yeah.
Okay.
Bean is absolutely correct. Again, in my world, when you're looking at how communities and police come together, you hear a lot of conversations relative to concepts. But until people own those concepts and the definitions behind them, for example, you hear in the United States now a lot of conversation about to defund the police. Well, what does that really mean? Because no one really wants a community or a society where you have anarchy in place. So defunding might very well be shifting resources, assets that have come into the police department more to social services. When you look at crime in and of itself, it's a microcosm of a variety of different issues. Okay, there may be some poverty issues in that community. There may be some mental health issues in that community. But if everybody's approaching these situations, these issues, with an or mindset, with an or mentality instead of an and mentality, you never will get to where you have sustainable solutions to issues in those communities. And the benefit is bringing the community and the police department together to help map out that process. Because to the extent, as Bina just stated, that they own it, they accept it as a part of their DNA, so that you don't have two disparate entities on this train track going down here. Nobody's grabbing hold of the other, and it's my way or the other way. No, it's got to be your way and my way, so that we have sustainable and just communities, whereby the police and the community can in fact come together.
Yeah, I also want to add that language plays an important part, and language reflects development as well. So I think noticing language, how we use language and how it impacts others and how it creates resistance because it promotes unipolar thinking is very important. So just for example, saying defund the police. If you say defund the police, you are going to get resistance from people who recognize that the police need to be funded. I mean, it's a no-brainer. There's no question of defunding the police. But it just sets up that opposition. If the motto instead was fund development, fund awareness, fund education, fund community, then you're augmenting, you're looking at what's missing, you're not trying to take away what has value.
Absolutely.
Okay. There is another question. Joe, would you like to respond to that before I go to the next
What was
question?
the other question?
Yeah. So the question is from Manikantan: Is polarity same as plurality? As a plural society, don't we have more than this versus that?
I'm gonna actually let Barry answer that one.
Sure. Yeah. Yes, we do, and we talk about multarities in that case. So it's a great question. So when we move from the situation where it's either this or that, and so we're in the world then of independence. So this is independent from that. Is this my hand or is this my elbow? Well, we're distinguishing this from that. And so when we're talking about those components, this and that, they might be, differentiable and independent of each other, right? So there's a sense in which I can choose. We're going to choose who's going to be the next president of the United States. So we're going to choose one or the other, and we're going to have that president. We go on. That's not a polarity. It's a problem to solve. Who do we choose to be our leader? So that either or arrangement is in the world of what I call independent variables. When we move into the world of interdependency, where inhaling needs exhaling, activity needs rest, centralized coordination needs decentralized initiatives, freedom needs equality. When we are getting into that world, the most elemental form of interdependence is two. Right? That's the smallest interdependency we can come up with is two. There is, however, a whole world of interdependency beyond two, well, which has just been raised. We call those multarities. So you can have an interdependency, for example, of mind, body, spirit. This is an interdependency that shows up in a lot of religious traditions. Do we pay attention to the mind, to the body, or the spirit? Well, the answer is yes. And so we can get into what we call multarities, which are interdependencies greater than two. And what helps us move into the world of multarities is that benchmark capability to see interdependency in the first place, which we define as polarities. So once you get a handle on polarities, this and this, it's much easy. It's also easy to go into multarities, which are interdependencies greater than two. And it leads us to, as Bina was showing on the spectrum that she talked about, it leads us to recognize that the whole universe is one dynamic interdependency. And so that kind of awareness becomes central.
Okay. Thank you, Barry. Just adjoining question there that from Dharmesh, what is the paradox of just looking at everything through polarity lens? What is the alternate way of looking at things other than polarity lens? And is there a possibility to expand on multirity?
Yes. So first of all, I'd like to say that we're talking about three different dimensions here right now. So there is a polarity, if you will, between or thinking, which is absolutely essential, and problem solving. And there is there's the other pole of both and thinking. So you have either or thinking is one pole and both and thinking is the other pole, and they need each other. So the rejection of or thinking is an example of or thinking. So first of all, you have these two dimensions of interdependency and independency. Now, when you get in the world of interdependency, there's also, as somebody has mentioned, there's interdependencies that are greater than two. Now, there's also a whole nother dimension which mystics describe for us, and I talk about this in the end of my book. We have a chapter in volume 2 of our book about multarities. That's one thing. But in the last chapter of the book called And, I talk about the whole book, and is sitting on one pole of a polarity, in which we're differentiating poles, and we're using language, and what faith communities and spiritual dimensions and mystics teach us is that there's a whole dimension of unity which is beyond any breakdown into polarities or multarities or anything, where there is no differentiation. There is a sense of unity and love which is underlying everything. And we move we can move in and out of that. So it could be called unity consciousness. But there's a, when we move into that space, when we find ourselves, and mystics visit that space, all of us through meditation or other means can move into that space. When we talk about it, we're back into the world of what Martin Buber calls the world of I, it, where there are things, we can talk about them and we can measure and we can awake, you know, and aware and arise. All of that is happening in the world of I, it, where there are objects where we can see things and take things apart and differentiate. But when we get into the world of I, thou, all differentiation disappears. And we have a unity consciousness, there's universal love, and that whole dimension we move in and out of. That is yet another polarity, moving in and from unity consciousness back into a multiplicity of consciousness and awareness, and then back into unity consciousness. So that is another dimension. And it is extremely important that we be able to go both into unity consciousness and back to the world of action, as well as action and reflection.
There's a couple of specific questions, if you don't mind, Ujjwal, I'm going to bring them
Sure,
up.
Bina, go ahead.
So that people are clear. So, and this question is very free, any of us can answer. How are polarities different from pros and cons that we always do when choosing options? That's one question. And then what suggestions do you have on helping clients see the connection of the other side of a polarity when they are stuck or anchored only on one side? So Barry or Joe, either of you could take that, because I have another one on development that I'd like to take.
I'll take the one on the when they're at odds. I think that was your second question, Bina, that you mentioned. The best thing about that is having facilitated conversation, because again, just think of shootings that might occur in a community where you're going to have the police on one side trying to approach these issues that are going on, and this community is totally on the opposite side. So one of the most important things you can do is to get a facilitator that has the ability that to facilitate and navigate through that conversation. Someone that can navigate identifying what some of the early warning signs might very well be for the downside of that polarity, or what might be some of the action steps that need to be taken by the community or by the police department so that you can name the upsides of the polarity. Because unless you have that and someone that's going to be an honest broker to the process, neither side is going to accept it. So it's very important that you've got someone to help facilitate that conversation, because people are in fact going to be locked into their own positions and not want to get off of it. But to the extent they build the map, to the extent they build the strategies, to the extent they build the action steps, it then becomes more inculcated and integrated into that community once the process of the facilitator and or others leave that community. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, and just to build on what Joe was just saying, is that one of the nice things about a polarity map is that it does provide a place for people who have values that are in tension to articulate their values and to have them show up. So it gives them a place where both their values and their fears can be laid out as legitimate and important to be considered. So exactly, just to support that.
And Barry, you want to point to the differences between the pros and cons as opposed to polarities, the pros and cons of a particular situation.
Yes, it depends on. So for example, if you're making a choice and you've got some ambivalence, should I go to graduate school or should I go out and get a job? I'm just finished college. Should I go to graduate school or get a job? I've got an either or choice here. I could go to graduate school. Or I could get a job, and I can say, well, what are all the positives about going to graduate school? And what would be all the positives about getting a job? I'm using those positives, or what's the problem if I go to graduate school? What's the problem if I get a job? So I can lay those out and inform my decision. Do I want to go to graduate school or get a job? So these pros and cons can help me make an either or choice. That's one way to make an either or choice. But if it is a polarity that you're doing the pros and cons about, what you're the basic assumption at the front end is that you're going to have to do both. So you're saying, so for example, if we go to healthcare and health and the economy, for example. So what we are saying is, what are the benefits of going after making sure we have a healthy economy, and what are the things we can do to make sure we have a healthy economy? And what are the things that would help us make sure we have a healthy citizenry? And how do we take care of healthcare? So how do we take care of the economy? What can we do to help that? And what can we do to take care of the health of our citizens? Because we're assuming in that exploration that we're going to have to do both. And so it's not using the either or to make a choice between one or the other. We're looking at the positives in terms of what it is we want to go after in both of them, because we can, in fact, need to do both. So that's the difference. Using a polarity map to decide an either or choice, you can do it, but it's sort of like using using a Stradivarius violin as a conga drum. You can use it that way, but that's not what it's intended for. Mm-hmm. So a polarity map is intended actually for helping you look at issues in which you have two interdependent variables and that you need to maximize both.
Thank you. I can now take the question on the vertical development from Joy Marie about how can we nurture this both and leading to vertical development in ourselves and in leadership. So I can give you some general guidelines. One is to look for the wisdom in the view that's opposite to yours. Look for the wisdom in somebody that doesn't agree with you and try and understand what is the value that they're offering. In terms of self-awareness, becoming aware of my own patterns, the assumptions that I'm making, and what are my preferences. So when I prefer something, I'm rejecting something. And so what is it that I'm preferring? What am I rejecting? And is there value in what I'm rejecting? And how can I hold a both and perspective? Being interested also in what applies at a higher level of the system, because then you'll have a higher level view. And that will allow you to take a more mature perspective instead of taking just a narrow context. Expanding that systems view, I think, is important. And mostly to be willing to see that there are things about myself that I don't know, as somebody said. I think, so these are some ideas. And I think the last one I'd say is, personally, one of the biggest developmental levers is to move towards what's difficult, to move towards what's painful. We tend to avoid some things that we are uncomfortable with. If we have difficult situations, we want to ignore it, we want to reject it, we want to suppress it. We want to avoid it because we want to avoid pain. And maturity lies in the direction of what's difficult. And when we navigate and negotiate what's difficult, then we come to a resolution at a higher level of understanding. And so that is what I would say for that question. I think, Ujjwal, over to you. I wanted to make sure that those couple of things got addressed.
Yeah, thanks, Beena. So just picking up one question where you have left, Beena, picking up from there. Question is for Barry, that what is the most compelling polarity you have explored within the organizations or leadership challenges of our times?
The one of them is stability and change. So with all organizations, we need to change, to grow, to develop. At the same time, we need to hold on to our traditions. We need to hold on to who we have been. So on the one hand, we need, individually, we need to respect and appreciate who we are and be excited about who we might be. And so, and as an organization, it's like we need to respect what the people who founded that organization and what they have built, the jobs they've created for others. We need to respect that history on the one hand. And on the other hand, we need to we need to look at what would be innovative and necessary. So that's one. I want to have a second one that is equally important, and is the polarity of justice and mercy. And this polarity is one in which we can let ourselves be who we are, with our foibles, with our mistakes, with our with our history. So we can look at an organization and say, this organization has really done some terrible things. They may have perpetuated systemic racism in all sorts of ways. We can look at our country and say, we've really done some terrible things in our country. Look at the United States, for example. It's true. There is, there is a history which we need to own up to, which has been really tragic. And at the same time, we need to recognize that we are all loved, that we can love this country. I can love my country, which I do deeply, and I can acknowledge that we have a history of warfare, of racism, of sexism, of poverty, which is are things that we need to own up to, we can acknowledge, and we can love our country at the same time. We can look towards a future in which we try to live out the best of ourselves and the best of our creed. And we don't have to project our own shortcomings onto anybody else. We don't have to project the shortcomings of the United States onto Russia or onto Germany or onto somebody else. We can own up to our shortcomings. So I think those are the two that are really important. And in relation to the part about justice and mercy, another important piece about seeing polarities. Seeing polarities is a way to see people more completely. And one of the things that my mentor Jack Gibb explained to me a number of years ago is that if we can see a person, if we can see a group, if we can see an organization or a country completely, love is a natural byproduct. And so that justice and mercy polarity is very important. And so when I find somebody, like Bina said, with whom I disagree, whose policies I think are absolutely outrageous, what I can know going in is I might stand against those policies, racist practices and policies. I may stand against them, and at the same time, I can know that there but for fortune go I, and that some of those inclinations are actually a part of me as well. Need to own my own racism and sexism rather than just project it on other people or my country. So that the whole justice and mercy is fundamental.
Great insights. Yes, Bina.
If you don't mind, it's a very juicy question and a simple one. This is from Anuradha. How may you help deal with a client who is stuck with being in control and is not looking at letting go for organizational growth? It's a great question. And then I'd invite Joe and Barry to add also. So one of the realities or principles of the polarity dynamic is that if you overfocus on one pole, then over time, you will undermine the very thing you're looking for. So if there's a person who's trying to keep control and keep control and keep control and not be able to let go over time, the little control that they have, they will lose. So just think about it, that you want to control because you want to get somewhere. And if you're over controlling, then nobody is going to go with you. I mean, there's just a whole lot of downsides will come up and you won't be able to get where you want to go. So one of the ways to help somebody get unstuck is to begin to see that if they control so much and don't let go, they're not going to be able to control anything. They're going to lose more and more power. And so there is greater power. In fact, there's greater outcomes for that person. If they're able to control and let go, then they can actually be more effective. So that's one piece of the answer. And so I would invite Joe and Barry to add to that, because this is the real stuff of everyday interactions, you know, how human beings, how we show up in day-to-day situations.
You know, that's great, Bina, because I'm sitting here just thinking about like human rights and communal obligations as polarity pairs and under polarity democracy. So you can look at a situation like gun control and gun rights. Okay, if you're talking about communities and in my world. And so how do you get those two individuals in the room to understand that we can't have a situation where, to the extent that gun control is being overshadowed by the gun rights, we have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in this country. But on the same hand, you know, we do, with our Second Amendment, give folks the rights to bear arms. So you've got to have people understand that it's not or, it's and. How do we coexist in this democracy, this great democracy of ours, so that everyone is not locked in on their positions? And that's going to take hard work, especially when you're thinking about the various concepts and the various policy situations that we're currently confronted with. But to the extent you can put those two opposing forces in that room, and that they can collaborate and that they can come together in developing the strategies. How do we have human rights and communal obligations collectively, as an example of Polarities of democracy, then that society is that much more better. So it is going to take hard work, as Bina just stated a few minutes ago. And for such as a time as this, as I said, and right now our world, our society is begging for solutions to help get them to the table and identify how we navigate these dilemmas that we got and for which we're confronted with. And Barry, you're the sensei. So again, I'll let you speak more, you know, to that point about getting the two in the room. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things you need to do is, for somebody who needs control, they need to be allowed to have it. So the question is, if you look at it being like directive and participative, that polarity, you know, somebody wants to be directive, I want to be in charge, I want to be in control, and they're afraid of going towards more participation, towards including others in participation. If you put that on a polarity map, you can see what the upside of direction is. What are the areas where we need to have control, and where he or she or they, you know, need to have that control. And so you need to, on the polarity map, you will look at ways by which the control that they want, some version of control, they will be able to sustain. Because we're not asking them to give up control, but to share essentially power. So it's like claiming and sharing power. But we need to make sure that they don't get caught in either a choice. Either I have all the control or I lose all the control. The question is what is within their control, what can they control, and how are they able to both control and share power, to both claim power and share power. So it's not taking it away from them, it is sharing it.
Great. Thank you, Barry. I think we are at the top of the hour, but one last point, which I think somebody was asking continuously, is that what are some of those top 2 or 3 tips you would like to share with us, that how we can promote more end thinking in the world to make it a better place?
Well, you can read the books that we're offering, for one. That will support you in looking at it. And you've been dealing with them your whole life, these polarities. So it's looking for situations which seem to be both and then you can put it out on your own simple version of a polarity map. But the important thing is that you not let go of or thinking, because the rejection of or thinking is an example of or thinking. So what we're trying to do is supplement or thinking with and thinking. And so you can do that by just watching for those times when it might make sense, and then play with it with somebody else, with the other person on a polarity map, and you will get more effective as you go.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Bina, for being here today. It was a great sharing of insights, great interactions. And on behalf of Kucharya, Magda, we wish you a great day ahead, and all of you are in different time zones, so great times ahead. And it was a wonderful hosting you today. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Ujjwal,
Most
for
welcome.
supporting us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pleasure is mine.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks, Joe.
All right, thank you,
Yep.
Bina.
Thank you.